Hello. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone about CEUs. Completing the 5 evaluations is required to earn CEUs. Follow the links in the email you received about this seminar to complete the evaluations. And don't forget to visit our website, BIANJ.org, to view the poster presentations. These research posters are being presented by senior level students in healthcare. This workshop, titled "Is New Jersey Traumatic Brain Injury Model Systems Centers Progress Update?" Our presenters are Dr. Nancy Cheravalate and Dr. Yelena Golden. Dr. Golden is a clinical and research neuropsychologist at JFK Johnson Rehabilitation Institute and the project director of their TBI Model Systems Center. She has over a decade of experience doing research, neuropsychological assessments, and cognitive rehabilitation with individuals with TBI and other neurocognitive disorders. Dr. Cheravalate is Director of Neuropsychology, Neuroscience, and Traumatic Brain Injury Research at Kessler Foundation and Research Professor of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Rutgers University, New Jersey Medical School, and the Project Director of the Northern New Jersey Traumatic Brain Injury Model System. Dr. Cheravalate has obtained over $16 million in grant funding, at least half of which has been in brain injury. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A tab located either at the bottom or the top of your screen, and they will be addressed during the Q&A in the later part of this workshop. This workshop will end promptly at 1:20 today. So with no further ado, I'm now going to hand it over to Dr. Yelena Golden.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having us here today to give an update on our model systems projects. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of a background of what model systems is and introduce our two centers. Then I will discuss the current local project and some updates on what we're doing at JFK. And then Dr. Cheravalate is going to speak a little bit about the research that they're doing at Kessler. So background of Traumatic Brain Injury Model Systems Centers. It is a program that was created in 1989 by the National Institute of Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, which was previously known as the National Institute of Disability and Rehabilitation Research. Its goal has always been to demonstrate the benefits of a coordinated system of neurotrauma and rehabilitation care, so the continuum of care of traumatic brain injury, as well as to conduct innovative research on all aspects of care for individuals with traumatic brain injury. It continues to this day to maintain its mission to improve the lives of people who have been affected by TBI by creating and disseminating new knowledge about both the natural course of TBI as well as about the outcomes of rehabilitation treatments. Over the last few years, it's reached greater heights by collaborations with various other institutions like the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Through that, it's created 5 PRC sites where the VA also does model systems research. It has collaborations with Department of Defense, the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke from the NIH, as well as the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. There are currently 16 TBI model system centers that hold 5-year grants to conduct this research, and there are several specific requirements that each center must meet in order to be selected for this grant. First and foremost, the center has to demonstrate a comprehensive system of brain injury care for individuals with TBI. This includes a full continuum of care from acute neurotrauma all the way through community reintegration. Centers must also propose to conduct a site-specific research study, which is what we'll be describing to you today. And that can be anything from rehabilitation studies to outcome measures and so forth. Sites must also engage in multi-site research, which requires a collaboration of at least 3 model system centers to conduct multi-site trials. And finally, centers must also contribute to the largest longitudinal database in traumatic brain injury to date, which is the Traumatic Brain Injury National Database. This database started collecting data in 1989, and participants are followed at specific increments. Data is collected during inpatient rehabilitation, which is considered baseline, that is at admission and at discharge from brain injury rehabilitation. Participants and then followed at 1 year post-injury, 2 years post-injury, 5 years post-injury, and then every 5 years thereafter. So these numbers represent how many participants have been recruited and followed currently, and these are a little outdated. The new data hasn't come out, but during the course of this current cycle, we're actually into collecting 25 and 30-year follow-up data. So as you can see, it's a pretty large database with a ton of information. New Jersey, being the most densely populated state in the country as we speak, is fortunate enough to have 2 traumatic brain injury model system centers. One center is the JFK Johnson Rehabilitation Institute, known as the JFK Johnson Rehabilitation Institute Traumatic Brain Injury Model System. And the other center is at Kessler Foundation, Kessler Institute for Rehabilitation, which is known as the Northern New Jersey Traumatic Brain Injury Model System. So next, I'm going to describe the research that we're engaged in as part of our local project at JFK Johnson. Then, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Cervellotti is going to describe the local site research project at Kessler's model system. And one thing you'll notice as we're describing our studies is that the projects between our centers are quite different. And as they are among all the 16 centers across the country. And this really contributes to this diversity in focus is what really contributes to the success of the Traumatic Brain Injury Model Systems program in its mission to advance the science and delivery of brain injury rehabilitation services over all these years. So the project at JFK is focused on assessing functional changes and activity limitations over the course of traumatic brain injury recovery. So traumatic brain injury affects the brain in a variety of ways. It can lead to disruptions and impairments in physical, cognitive, and emotional functions. These impairments, in turn, can impact a person's ability to perform daily activities. This includes both basic activities of daily living, such as bathing, grooming, dressing, feeding, transfers, and other aspects of mobility. And it also affects instrumental activities of daily living, which include things like preparing meals, shopping, managing finances, managing medications, communication through telephone calls or mobile means, transportation, and so on. And needless to say that these activity limitations can make engagement in life situations extremely challenging. As rehabilitation professionals, we want to try to understand the post-TBI challenges I just described in the previous slide. And the best way to accomplish this is through functional assessment, which uses instruments that help us identify the types of difficulties patients experience and assign what we hope to be a meaningful score or a number to quantify the extent of these difficulties. Functional assessment helps us determine the type and degree of difficulty a person has in performing normal everyday activities. And this is important because it helps us in several different ways. It helps us identify the rehabilitation needs of our patients. It helps us select the most optimal treatments to help them improve and function. It helps us evaluate treatment effectiveness, which is vital both for our ongoing treatment as well as for reimbursement purposes. And it helps us identify accommodations and any support needs that patients might have as they're moving towards and into community reintegration. Functioning can be conceptualized to exist on 3 different levels. And although the slide presents this in a very linear manner, the relationship between these levels is usually not very simple, not very linear, and not very direct. So at the most basic level is impairment. Impairment refers to the injury's direct impact on the mechanisms that give rise to meaningful behaviors. These would be the underlying body functions that are the precursors to meaningful activities. They're usually assessed through construct-led measures where we try to capture the integrity of the underlying processes necessary for successful task completion, but we don't necessarily measure the task itself. So consider, for example, when we do a neuropsychological assessment, we assess specific brain functions and try to make inferences about how those functions might then translate to daily functioning based on these cognitive abilities. What we do know from ecological validity literature is that this level of assessment doesn't always accurately predict performance or limitations. The next level of assessment is activity limitations or activity performance, which aims to assess the difficulty in executing real-world tasks. It's usually aimed at instrumental activities of daily living, but some of the instruments also capture basic activities as well. If you consider the FIM, for example. This is clearly affected by impairment, and it translates to difficulty in participation. It's usually assessed by self or proxy report or by an observer rating performance in the simulated environment. Simulated environments are good for assessment, but they do tend to be too sterile and too controlled, and usually are less indicative of real world performance or activity than patient or proxy reports. This level of assessment also doesn't provide us information about any impairments that that may be leading to activity limitations. It also doesn't provide us a lot of information about the person's actual translation of these activity performances to community participation. But that said, assessment at this level has been shown to be much more predictive of real-world functioning than assessing somebody at the impairment level. And finally, the last level is participation, which refers to involvement in real life situations. While this is the ultimate and final outcome, there are numerous factors that are far, far beyond the control of rehabilitation, such as economic factors, motivational factors, psychological factors, opportunities in general, just to name a few, which renders assessment at this level quite an ineffective way to target treatment. Another way of looking at this is to consider that impairment reflects capacity of the organism to perform under the most optimal conditions. And participation is synonymous with performance, or what actually occurs in everyday life. And as I just mentioned, there could be many factors that prevent translation from capacity to performance. Activity performance or activity limitations seems to be the relevant middle ground between capacity and performance. Therefore, it's an area that presents rehabilitation professionals with the greatest opportunity to modify performance. And it's considered to be the most meaningful target of TBI rehabilitation. So if we agree that activity limitations and improvement in the ability to perform functional tasks and activities of daily living is the most proximal and meaningful goal of traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, then it becomes important to consider and understand the principles and challenges related to the assessment of this domain. Because rehabilitation professionals are not only tasked with selecting the best and most optimal treatments for patients, but also with the responsibility of measuring progress and demonstrating treatment effectiveness, both for the good of our patients, but also for reimbursement purposes. Now, we all know that TBIs vary greatly between people in types of causes, in severity, and in recovery, which results in great variability in functional abilities of patients who sustain the injury. There has been a growing appreciation, and we've all heard Dr. Corrigan speak this morning about the chronicity of TBI, which means that functional recovery after TBI, as well as functional impairments, can occur over the course of days, months, or even years after the injury. And different functions may recover at different rates and different trajectories. Some functions may remain compromised or even worsen and require additional specialized treatments. Given the diversity of limitations and the recovery after TBI, it's essential to have tools that can assess the large range of activity performance and track functional recovery trajectories, not only over time, but also across treatment settings. And unfortunately, this critical feature is currently missing from a lot of available functional measures. So this slide is very wordy, and the point of it is to provide details about the Impact Act of 2014. This law really highlighted the most critical limitations of the widely used functional assessment tools that we have in rehabilitation today. These limitations include high floor and ceiling effects, leaning too heavily towards impairments, and being generally impractical to apply in more than one specific rehabilitation setting, which really limits our ability to track functioning across the continuum of TBI care without having to switch to a different measure or a different metric. As a result, the CARE tool, which is the Continuity Assessment Record and Evaluation, has recently replaced the FIM, which has been used for years as the go-to functional assessment measure in inpatient rehabilitation settings. Now, from what we have learned through crosswalk research within the TBI model systems community is that while there's good correspondence between this new CARE tool and FIM motor functions, it doesn't correlate very well with FIM cognitive domains, which really tells us that we're assessing something completely different than we used to in the past when we were looking at cognitive functions. So there really remains a need to identify functional measures that can help us reliably capture all aspects of cognitive and motor functional performance in traditional ways. So in our projects, in our local project at JFK, we're hoping to address these needs that I just identified. The clinical need to implement functional assessment tools that are capable of capturing the occurrence of the changes in functional limitations over time in order to accurately assess patient needs and treatment effectiveness in a continuous, meaningful, and longitudinal manner without having to switch tools. And also to capture data on functional recovery across settings, between patients, and over time, because this information is still pretty limited in TBI rehabilitation. And obviously, we have to have good tools because there's a legislative mandate that tells us we have to. So the tool that appeared to be most promising as we look through the available tools at JFK is the activity measure of post-acute care, which we'll refer to as the AMPAC. The AMPAC was designed to measure functional outcomes across all post-acute care settings. It can be done on the inpatient rehabilitation as well as all aspects of outpatient settings and after discharge. And it allows for tracking of patients' functional status as they move across the continuum of care. It can be completed both by patients and by proxies. So the recommendation is that when the inpatient versions are done, the proxies be therapists because they have evaluated the various aspects of patients' performance. And once patients move beyond the inpatient settings, proxies are recommended to be family members, caregivers, or somebody who really knows the patient well. And the AMPAC was developed with consideration of the multifaceted nature of activity functioning. It's divided into specific functional domains, which captures basic mobility, daily activities, and applied cognition. And it also captures multiple aspects of activity performance by assessing difficulty in performing daily tasks, the need for assistance in performing daily tasks, and overall limitations. The AMPAC is comprised of more than 300 functional activities that patients rate or proxies rate, which are organized in these three functional areas that I mentioned: basic mobility, daily activity, and applied cognitive. There are computer and pen and paper-based versions. Pen and paper-based versions obviously are comprised of specific non-changing items that can be administered to responders over and over. And computer-based versions use computer adaptive testing, which was developed using item reduction theory in mind, with each subsequent item being selected from this large item bank based on previous responses, which minimizes the number of questions that need to be asked and eliminates items that are too easy or too difficult. So needless to say, as opposed to traditional pen and paper-based forms, it is much more time and resource conservative. We've found that it takes about an average about 4 to 10 minutes, depending on patient complexity, to complete all three forms: basic mobility, daily activity, and applied cognitive. All AMPAC forms and versions, regardless of the mode of completion or who completed it, yields the same metrics, which really allows for comparison across patients, between forms, between respondents, and across all rehabilitation settings. The AMPAC has been validated in individuals with stroke, with complex medical conditions, with orthopedic injuries, pretty much at all levels of rehabilitation, but unfortunately, it has not yet been studied in individuals with TBI. There are two different score conversions. For clinicians, it has, who are used to psychometrics, it has a meaningful conversion into T-scores, which has the standard mean of 50 and the standard deviation of 10. It also yields a more meaningful interpretation. So these T-scores then become converted into specific functional stages. And in the next several slides, I have examples of what these stages look like within each domain. And this really provides a meaningful context for interpretations that allow us to communicate findings to, in a digestible way to consumers. And functional stages follow a hierarchical structure where each stage represents increasingly more difficult activities and more proficiency and greater level of independence. So here you can, I'm not going to get into all the details of every stage, but you can see that for basic mobility, it goes from not being able to really perform any movement activities independently to full independence in all strenuous activities. For daily activities, you see the same thing where a patient is fully dependent to being completely independent and being able to do all activities on their own. And for applied cognitive, again, being fully dependent in all aspects of cognitive applied behavior, such as using telephone, reading, having conversations, to being fully independent on all independent activities, of instrumental activities of daily living. So as you can see, we feel that AMPAC can potentially bridge many of the current gaps of functional assessment, the floor to ceiling effects, the being able to move across different levels of activity limitations and across the different rehabilitation settings, all the way into the stages of community reintegration. And it also meets the legislative requirements and standards of having a common metric across the various rehabilitation settings. Unfortunately, it has not been evaluated or validated in individuals with traumatic brain injury. So our objective at JFK and in our current local project is to evaluate the applicability of the AMPAC for use in individuals with TBI, and also to apply it to assess activity limitations over the course of TBI rehabilitation. Our specific aims are threefold. Our primary aim is to evaluate the sensitivity of AMPAC to measure changes in activity limitations in TBI. We're doing this in two separate samples. In our inpatient samples by looking across the first year of injury, and I'll get into more details of what that looks like. And in our outpatient sample by looking at changes from before to after specialized outpatient rehabilitation. We're also examining convergent and discriminant validity to further validate this measure in TBI by looking at the relationship between the AMPAC and the more traditional scales of functioning in TBI. And we're also evaluating patient proxy agreement. And one of the reasons for this is because due to cognitive issues and awareness issues being quite common after traumatic brain injury, we wanted to see if those difficulties might lead to patients rating themselves differently than the proxies do, and therefore their agreement not being the same as they're seeing in other populations. So this slide shows who we're enrolling and our inclusion-exclusion criteria. So as I mentioned, we have the inpatient and the outpatient sample. All our participants have to have a documented traumatic brain injury. They have to be at least 18 years of age, and they have to be English speaking, mainly because the AMPAC is available in English at this point, and most of the traditional rehabilitation measures of function that we're using are also only available in English. So for the inpatient sample, the requirements are only that patients be on our brain trauma unit after a traumatic brain injury, and that they can provide informed consent. On the outpatient sample, they have to be receiving outpatient rehabilitation in our Center for Brain Injury. They have to be able to provide informed consent, but we're also requiring that they have adequate communication skills to be able to complete the rest of the testing, which I'll describe in a minute. We're excluding patients for whom cognitive complaints or neurological dysfunction cannot be directly attributed to TBI because it preceded their TBI, and patients with any active psychiatric illness or substance abuse, because that can seriously skew their responses on functional measures, and we may not be able to attribute some difficulties directly to the brain injury itself. So this is these are our outcome measures for our inpatient and outpatient sample. Again, on the inpatient sample, the goal is mainly to look at recovery of functional measures of functioning longitudinally. So we don't have too many discipline-specific measures. We are comparing patients on the FIM to the AMPAC, and at 1 year post-injury, we're using the participation assessment with recombined tools, which is a community reintegration, community participation outcome measure that is already embedded in 1 year follow-up assessment in model systems, and we're comparing that against the AMPAC. At the outpatient level, we are testing patients both pre and post-treatment using these other measures listed here. So we're comparing basic mobility AMPAC against the dynamic gait index, which is a traditional functional measure of mobility used by physical therapists. We're comparing daily activities against the Texas Functional Living Scale, a traditional outpatient therapy measure, and we're comparing applied cognitive against neuropsychological assessment battery daily living scales, which is the best available functional assessment measure in neuropsychology. We're also using the impaired self-awareness item from the Mayo Portland Adaptability Inventory, which is completed by patients' therapists in order to determine the existence and extent of any awareness difficulties so that we can use it in our analysis to see if it interferes or impacts reporting in any way. So this is a visual representation of our study. As you can see on the inpatient side, we're administering the AMPAC at admission, at discharge, at 6 months follow-up. And the reason we're using a 6-month time point is because a lot of new research has been suggesting that this is really where patients seem to take a turn after traumatic brain injury. And sometimes there is a dip in activity, performance, and functional measures during the course of recovery. And then we're finally assessing them at 1 year post-TBI. We're only doing patient proxy measures during discharge because that is the only time we're able to collect proxy measures. Our therapists, the AMPAC is embedded very well into our system at JFK, and therapists consistently and systematically complete the AMPAC on all patients at admission and discharge. And we felt that at admission, patients might still be in confusional post-traumatic amnesia states, and it was too soon to really try to assess their perceived functioning at that stage. But when they're ready for discharge, it seemed like a good time to see how they're perceiving their functioning and look at patient proxy agreement. But again, that is not the ultimate goal of this arm of the study. The ultimate goal is really to look at longitudinal trajectories of functional recovery. On outpatient, we're testing patients at 2 time points before and after they receive outpatient rehabilitation for brain injury. And here they're getting the same measures both before and after treatment. We're getting patient AMPAC and proxy AMPAC. Proxies are identified by patients and confirmed independently. They are usually caregivers or significant others who know the patient really well. And we're administering all the traditional functional assessment measures both before and after. So at this point, we're about 2 years into data collection, and we do have some preliminary findings, which I am going to share with you now. So our first aim was to evaluate AMPAC sensitivity to changes in activity limitations. So is AMPAC capturing anything? So here you see for our inpatient sample, from admission to 1 year post-injury, both on basic mobility, daily activities, and applied cognitive. The blue lines represent therapist ratings, and the red lines represent patient ratings. So as you can see, the therapists are reporting that from admission to discharge for inpatient rehabilitations, patients are improving significantly. In each case, you see at least a 10-point improvement, which is one standard deviation based on T-score conversions. I think the most striking finding that we're seeing is that there's a huge discrepancy between therapists and patients at the one time point where we are collecting that patient proxy agreement on each scale. One of the reasons for this may go back to that capacity versus performance dichotomy that I described earlier. And the therapists have done a really good assessment of patients' impairments, and they're likely using that as the benchmark for rating patients on the AMPAC. And again, we know that there are not always perfect direct translations from impairments to actual abilities to perform functional activities. The patients are likely more aware of their performance prior to injury, and they're likely using their performance as a benchmark for responding to AMPAC items. So again, if we conceptualize of activity performance and activity limitations as that middle measure, we can see that we can conceptualize that the benchmark people are using to respond to these items without actually being able to observe the specific activity might lead to these discrepancies. I think from discussion with our therapists, there are also liability issues about overrating patients and the concern for patients engaging in strenuous activities before they're ready for them and becoming re-injured. What is interesting is that the patient's ratings remain relatively similar or even improve even as they remain in the community and have had the opportunity to engage in these activities and gauge their actual abilities. And they're not really dropping at 6-month follow-up the way some literature suggests. So this is, these are the findings from our outpatient sample. So the blue lines represent admission and the green lines represent discharge. So as you can see, there are some improvements from admission to discharge in all domains. And they were all statistically significant based on statistical analyses. And what you can also see is that patients and proxies here are rating activity performance quite similarly. Our next aim was to examine the relationship between AMPAC and traditional discipline-specific measures of function. So first, we're going to look at inpatient correlations, and what we're seeing are perfect correlations pretty much for an admission and discharge between all AMPAC scales and all FIM scales. And one reason for this may be that we have the same rater, the therapist, and very likely they're using the FIM as the benchmark for completing the AMPAC. Either that or they're using the same benchmark, which is impairment, for completing both the FIM and the AMPAC. So these correlations are good, but they're probably to be expected. At 1 year post-injury, when we're looking at correlations between AMPAC and community participation, we're also seeing some interesting correlations arising. So basic mobility on the AMPAC was significantly related to being able to work. Daily activities impact correlated with homemaking, working, socialization with friends, shopping, and attending sporting events. And applied cognitive was related to providing emotional support to others, dining out, shopping, and attending sporting events. For outpatient, we looked at correlations between both patients and proxies on specific discipline outcomes. And what we found is that for proxies, only mobility, only the dynamic gait index specifically correlated with the various scales of the AMPAC. And for patients on admission, we had some correlations between Texas living scales for both basic mobility and applied cognitive, but not for daily activities, which is really where we expected it to load. Judgment assessed by neuropsychological functioning was significantly correlated with all the AMPAC measures, and cognitive functioning on the AMPAC significantly correlated with driving. After discharge, we only saw correlations between cognitive AMPAC and daily living memory, which assesses things like remembering somebody's address, remembering to pay specific bills, remembering instructions to taking medications, which is really what AMPAC cognitive captures. And it was also related to driving. So again, one reason we may not be seeing a lot of loading the way we anticipated or hypothesized may be that our numbers are not quite where they should be yet, although we have recruited about 66 patients so far. But another reason could again go back to that discrepancy between impairment and actual activity performance. And although these measures, these discipline-specific traditional measures are theoretically aimed at capturing functioning, they are still more impairment-based than actual performance of activities themselves. And our final aim was to evaluate agreement between patient and proxy respondents. So if you remember those graphs on inpatient that I showed you before, there are huge discrepancies between AMPAC responses for inpatient therapists and patients at discharge. And not surprisingly, there was absolutely no relationship between those ratings. On the outpatient side, both at pre and post-treatment, every AMPAC scale correlated between patient responses and their informant responses. So we have very strong agreement. I'm just going to give you a quick update to the current status of our study. So for inpatient, we're anticipating enrolling approximately 100 participants with the goal of retaining 80 at 1-year follow-up to have a fully powered study. Within the last 2 years, we enrolled 57. We were able to follow 45 at 6 months follow-up and 27 at 1-year follow-up. Now, that doesn't mean we lost a lot of participants. Their follow-up just hasn't come up yet. We did have 2 people withdraw at 6-month follow-up, and we had to disqualify 3 participants at 6 months and 1 participant at 1 year because they developed either significant active substance abuse or major psychiatric issues. We lost 4 patients at 6 months and 4 patients at 1-year follow-up that we were just unable to locate them, and 1 patient expired since we started the study. At outpatient, we enrolled 68 participants. We completed admission data on 66 of them. 2 of them withdrew prior to completing baseline data. And we have completed 43 post-treatment assessments so far. We did lose 12 people to follow up, and on 4 of them, we were able to obtain partial data. So really what we're learning so far from our study, given our very preliminary findings, is that AMPAC can be completed by various responders for individuals with TBI. The congruency between those responders is, as you can see, dependent on setting. You see that there are large discrepancies between inpatient therapists and patients during inpatient rehab. I'd mentioned some of the reasons for that, but this is really something for us to keep exploring. And once we're able to get back into the hospital and the lab, our plan is to schedule focus groups with our therapists to really go through this data with them and help and brainstorm some of the reasons. But our statisticians are also working on helping us develop statistical ways to evaluate bias and consider what may lead into bias both for therapists and for patients. So it's likely to be a good measure of activity limitations in TBI. But ANPAC scale scores may not correspond very well to some traditional clinic-based functional assessment tools. And I think that is partially to be expected given the reference points for these tools, and if we consider the impairment activities and community participation continuum. So hopefully we'll have more data soon and can update you with better answers than what we have today. So I thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Charvelati now, and she will talk to you about the amazing research that they're doing at Kessler.
Thank you, Dr. Golden. That was really interesting. It's nice to have a study where you can look at the data while you're moving through it, because unfortunately, we're not able to look at our data, as everybody will see today. I'm just going to... Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the site-specific project that we're conducting as part of our TBI model system at Kessler Foundation. The title is Applying Strategy-Based Techniques to Enhance Memory to Treat New Learning and Memory Deficits in Individuals with TBI. As some of you may know, who may have attended my morning workshop, my main area of focus for my research is on cognitive rehabilitation of memory functioning in various neurological conditions, one of which is traumatic brain injury. So I'm going to be updating you on our TBI model system progress on our current study to date. So as we all know, traumatic brain injury has many concomitants. We have physical deficits that patients have to deal with post-TBI, changes in emotional functioning, behavioral changes, as well as cognitive deficits. We're going to be focusing today on cognitive deficits. That's the focus of pretty much all of my research. And I'd like to talk a little bit about why we care about cognition and why cognition is so important. Cognition has a huge impact on daily life. Cognitive deficits lead to depression and anxiety. They lead to decreased participation in the community. They lead to increased unemployment, which then leads to financial difficulties. And they also lead to a overall decreased quality of life. And this has all been shown in the literature. So theoretically, improving cognition could potentially lead to decreased emotional symptomatology, increased participation, hopefully return to work in some capacity, and an overall improved quality of life. So if we can effectively treat cognition in persons who are living with traumatic brain injury, we have a great potential to really have a substantial impact on their overall quality of life. So there are many cognitive changes following traumatic brain injury. Cognitive deficits are very common, particularly with moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. We see deficits in executive functioning, processing speed, working memory, and attention. We also see memory dysfunction in a lot of people who are living with TBI, and that really is a cardinal feature post-TBI. It is what most people complain about when they go into a clinician's office, is that my memory just stinks. I need help learning and remembering new information, because it really has a profound impact on daily life. So before we start talking about the treatment protocol that we're testing in our current model system study, I want to talk a little bit about the memory process and break it down a little bit. So the memory process can be broken down into 3 stages. The first stage is encoding. So encoding is the process by which we learn new information. So when you meet someone and they tell you their name, you're encoding that new information. And that's a very important part of the memory process, because if you don't initially encode information, you can't remember that information later. And it's encoding. When we talk about learning, that's encoding. We're talking about learning and encoding are very similar constructs. Following encoding, you have consolidation. So consolidation is the process by which the memories become permanent. And I like to equate it to building a house. When you lay the foundation with cement, you have to let it dry. That's consolidation. It's letting our memories harden. And much of this happens during sleep, although it happens in other aspects of our daily life as well. And then finally, you have retrieval. It's retrieval that's blamed for all of our memory problems, because when we are trying to remember something, it's actually retrieval that we're engaging in at the time at which we can't remember. But that doesn't mean that it's retrieval that is the culprit in our inability to learn and remember information. And I'll explain that right now. So a study that was done published in 2000 by Dr. John DeLuca at Kessler Foundation looked specifically at memory dysfunction following TBI. And what he was looking at was where in that memory process people are experiencing failure. Was it learning or was it retrieval? And what he found was that it was learning. He modified a learning test so that the learning test could be administered with an unlimited number of trials. And what he looked at was how long it took persons with TBI to meet a learning criterion versus healthy controls. And that learning criterion was perfect repetition of a list of 10 words on 2 consecutive trials. So what he found was that persons with TBI took significantly more trials to learn information, but they were able to learn that information. And that's what's really important here. That's what's really informing cognitive rehab protocol development, is that persons with TBI are able to learn information. It's just taking them more repetitions or more time. When they learned that information, they recalled it and they recognized it at equivalent rates to healthy controls. So it was available to them and they were able to use it. The challenge was that initial learning of information. So what does that mean? Why do we care about that? Well, what we've identified is that learning is a problem in people who are living with traumatic brain injury. So the next step is identifying an effective treatment that targets learning specifically, not retrieval, but learning. So that's what we've been doing. We've been trying to treat the learning deficit. And what we're hoping to see is an improvement in memory functioning that would be based on a neuropsychological assessment, improvement in overall quality of life, and an improvement in daily functioning. So in terms of treating the deficit, it's really important that cognitive deficits post-TBI are treated, and that is actually happening in a large majority of rehabilitation facilities across the world. Cognitive rehabilitation is very common. It's used in multiple settings, both inpatient and outpatient, and the evidence in support of cognitive rehabilitation is building. It's building across domains in attention, working memory, and executive functioning. And it's building utilizing different outcomes. The most common outcome is objective cognitive performance, which is your neuropsychological assessment. That's really the gold standard for evaluating cognitive rehabilitation. However, we're also starting to apply new outcomes, particularly looking at everyday life or functional cognition, as Dr. Golden mentioned, and looking at neuroimaging findings. So there is a building literature. There's a lot of focus on cognitive rehabilitation in traumatic brain injury as well as other populations, but there are major holes. So one major hole is the lack of class 1 evidence. It's class 1 evidence that truly informs us as to which treatments work and which treatments don't work. Class 1 evidence is results from studies that apply rigorous methodology, such as randomized clinical trials. And I'm going to be talking more about a randomized clinical trial. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about just what that term means. A randomized clinical trial is a study in which persons who come into the research are randomized to randomly assigned to either a treatment group or a control group. The treatment group gets the treatment at hand. The control group does not. The control group engages in some other activity. Those two groups are blinded, which means the patients don't know what group they were in. And then we test efficacy, or we test their functioning after treatment is completed. And the reason we do that is to be able to compare people who were treated to people who were not treated, but don't know what group they were in, so that we can control for things like bias, because very often if you're in treatment, you just automatically feel better because you're in treatment. So we want to control for that type of bias. The ultimate goal of this class 1 evidence is really to impact, the ultimate clinical goal is really to show clinicians what works and what doesn't work, as well as impact reimbursement rates. We want the insurance companies to start to pay for these treatments and pay at a high rate, because that's what's going to enable more patients to be able to enjoy the benefits of the treatment. So much of our work recently has focused on strategy training. Strategy training shows substantial promise based on existing data, but there are a few methodologically rigorous studies that look at strategy training from a research perspective. So there is empirical support for strategy training, and there's substantial data in healthy controls. There are hundreds of studies that have utilized different types of strategy training in undergraduate students or in young adults, healthy people, where their memory is really intact and we're looking to enhance their memory. What has been shown in that literature is that the gains that they experience following memory strategy training remains for several months. So when we talk about strategy training, we're talking about several different techniques: visual imagery, story development, self-generation, self-testing, spaced learning, errors learning, and repetitive recall drills. And I'm going to be talking more about this, which is why I just ran through that list quickly. We know that recall performance improves after strategy training. However, the data on the generalization to daily life is limited. So what that means is we know that strategy training influences results of a neuropsychological assessment, but we don't know if patients are able to actually apply these strategies in their daily life and use them. In addition, structured treatment protocols are not available. So while clinicians may know strategies and be able to discuss them and apply them, they don't have structured treatment protocols that are manualized, that are available to them to be able to just administer to a patient. So in terms of the strategy training, I'm going to be talking about the list on the left, which is visual imagery, story development, self-generation, self-testing, and spaced learning. I'm not going to be talking about errorless learning for two different reasons. Actually, I'm not going to be talking about errorless learning because errorless learning there's a lot of literature on errorless learning, and errorless learning has been applied to rehabilitation populations successfully for quite some time. So we didn't really focus in on errorless learning because we didn't need to address that void in the literature because it's already been done. We didn't focus on repetitive recall drills for another reason, and that is because of a study we did that looked specifically at the repetition effect. The repetition effect is simply repeating information. The theory behind the repetition effect is that information that's repeated will be remembered better than information that's presented only once. And that is indeed true in healthy individuals. If you repeat information, they will definitely remember it better than information they only hear one time. So we conducted a study to see if persons with neurological injury or illness show better memory if we just repeat information more times. And the answer to that was no. So simply repeating information does no good. It doesn't help the individual remember new information. It's simply frustrating for the person who is repeating that information. So that was a very important finding. What we have focused on in our research are the list on the left. So we have one protocol that focuses on visual imagery and story development. And that's a protocol that I spoke about in a workshop I did this morning called the modified story memory technique. And this is just a real quick recap of what I talked about this morning. What we showed with the modified story memory technique, and this was funded by the Northern New Jersey TBI Model System Program from 2007 to 2012, we saw a significant improvement in prose learning from before to after treatment with the story memory technique in persons with traumatic brain injury. That is depicted in the figure here on the left. And then on the right, we were also able to see changes on functional neuroimaging. So we saw increased activity in the default mode network, decreased activity in the executive control network, which indicated that encoding strategies were becoming more efficient at the level of the brain post-treatment. In the current model system, we're looking at different techniques. In the current model system, we're looking at self-generation, self-testing, and spaced learning. And that's all within the umbrella of a treatment protocol that we call STEM. So self-generation refers to the notion that information that is self-generated is remembered better than information that is simply provided to a person to remember. So if I say it's unlucky to walk under A, and I ask you to generate that last term, which would be ladder, you would remember the word ladder better than if I simply told you to remember the word ladder. That's despite the fact that the sentence is very leading. Very few people actually generate the wrong word when you give them this sentence. It's a very leading sentence, but you're still able to remember it better simply because you generated it. In a more functional capacity, this may be used in a home where someone in the home may say to the person, when you go to the store, please pick up that stuff we use to clean our teeth. So it's a very silly way to phrase the request. However, it is much more effective than if you say, please pick up toothpaste while you're out. So looking at the data we have on self-generation following TBI, this was some of the preliminary work we did prior to the development of this treatment protocol. In gray, you see the healthy control group. In black, you see the group that has traumatic brain injury. The solid lines are the generated condition, and the dotted lines are the provided condition. So in both cases, you see both healthy controls are remembering information better in the generated condition than in provided condition, as well as the persons who have traumatic brain injury. They're remembering information better in the generated condition, which is the solid line, than in the provided condition. But one thing that's really important to notice here I just want you to focus on these two center lines, comparing the black solid line to the gray dotted line. The gray dotted line represents healthy individuals remembering information under normal learning conditions. This is provided information. The black solid line represents persons with TBI remembering information under the generated condition. And what we're seeing here is that under the generated condition, persons with TBI are remembering information almost to the level of healthy controls. So this really is improving their ability to learn and remember information on these this is a lab-based task. The second technique within STEM is spaced learning. Spaced learning refers to the notion that new learning is significantly improved when trials are distributed over time or spaced, compared to consecutive learning trials, such as massed presentation. And this is really the juice behind telling individuals that they should not be cramming for exams, that they should be studying slowly over a period of time. Because if information is spaced out, we learn it better than if it's massed. And there's been a recent review of 317 spaced learning studies across 184 articles that has concluded that this is indeed the fact. We have more than 100 years of research showing that spaced learning is definitely effective. So we had the question of, is this effective in persons who have traumatic brain injury because their neurological functioning has been disrupted? So does this change? And in fact, the spacing effect is effective in traumatic brain injury. And up here in the solid black line, this is persons with TBI learning information under a spaced condition. So they're learning information much more efficiently when it's spaced over time than when it's massed. The third strategy that we teach within STEM is retrieval practice or self-testing. This is based on the notion that testing someone's memory for information results in greater retrieval of that information in the future than simply providing the information to the person multiple times. So another thing in our educational system that we do is we quiz. So quizzing is really based on retrieval practice or self-testing. We know that if someone is quizzed on information, they're going to remember it better than if they're simply provided that information repeatedly. So there are many everyday life examples to this, such as quizzing, or some people use the index card method to study, where you have one term on the front of the card and you have the explanation on the back of the card, and you quiz yourself. Some people may remember in grade school, I know when I was in grade school, we had the PQRST method, where T was testing. So you were testing yourself on the information before you had to remember that information in a learning environment and had to prove that you knew that information. So we looked at the testing effect in TBI. And what we found was that persons who were tested on information learned it better than persons in which we simply repeated that information. But the other thing we found here was that when we combined methods, when we combined spaced restudy and testing, or the retrieval practice, we had a much more powerful effect. So what we found is that while both groups benefited from retrieval practice over mass study and spaced restudy, when you combined both retrieval practice and spaced restudy, you had a much more significant effect. So that's what led to the development of strategy-based techniques to enhance memory, which we call STEM. This is the treatment protocol that we're testing in our current TBI model system study. The focus of STEM is improving everyday life. So STEM teaches persons and significant others how to apply novel techniques in their daily life. So it's teaching them how to apply these techniques. It's teaching them the application of self-generation, space learning, and self-testing in their daily life. And the actual treatment protocol uses daily life material. It's not administered or taught based on artificial material. It consists of 8 sessions, and the 8 sessions, we like to involve a significant other where possible. It's very often not possible, so we're very often dealing with only the patient. And there are 3 techniques that are taught across those 8 sessions. So this is the layout of the sessions. Session 1 focuses on assessment results and memory education. So prior to session 1, and prior to the most cognitive rehabilitation protocols, even in the clinical realm, a neuropsychological assessment is done. So within session 1 of STEM, we go over that neuropsychological assessment and we talk about what the person's strengths and weaknesses are and where they really need to focus. Within that session, we also have a memory education. So what is memory and what is not memory? So when you rush in the house and you drop your keys because you have to run to the bathroom and then you forgot where your keys are, is that a memory problem? Probably not. You were probably in a hurry and you didn't pay attention to where you put your keys. So we're blaming memory. We always say, oh, I can't remember where I put my keys. However, we never really paid attention to where we put our keys. So it's probably the fact that we didn't pay attention to it to begin with. So examples like that are included. So we're explaining to the person what is memory and what is not memory. Sessions 2 to 3 focus on self-generation, teaching patients self-generation and then using examples to help them learn the technique. Sessions 4 to 5 focus on space learning. Again, teaching them space learning in sessions 4, what it is and how you use it. And then in session 5, focusing in more on how to apply it. Sessions 6 to 7 focus on self-testing. Again, the same layout. The first of the 2 sessions talks about what it is and provides examples. And then the second of those 2 sessions focuses on application to daily life. And then session 8 puts it all together. So in session 8, what we do is we practice applying the techniques and combining the techniques in different memory demanding situations. So we have published pilot data on STEM in the multiple sclerosis population. We have not published our pilot data in traumatic brain injury because it's a smaller sample, but this multiple sclerosis sample was a little bit bigger. And what we found was, again, the focus of STEM is to change everyday life behavior. So our primary outcome was everyday life. And this was really evaluated via questionnaires. So this is the mental health inventory behavioral control subscale on the left. And what we see is a nice improvement in the treatment group shown in gray and a small improvement in the control group. But we have this nice significant improvement in the treatment group. And then when we look at the positive affect scale, we see the same pattern where we see a really nice improvement in the treatment group and we actually see a decline in the control group. So we're seeing a nice impact on the mental health inventory.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to remind you that there's 10 minutes remaining until the session ends.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we also saw an improvement from before to after treatment in the SF-36 role limitations. So a lower score here is better. So in the treatment group, you see a nice decline in their evaluations, whereas in the control group, we see an increase. And then finally, on the bottom, the other thing we looked at was the FAMS. It was a measure of general contentment from before to after STEM. And we saw a nice improvement in the treatment group, and we saw a decline in the control group from before to after treatment. So we're seeing these really nice changes in our pilot work in the MS population. We saw the same trends in the TBI population. It was just a much smaller sample. So it's nicer to present larger samples. So we're seeing really nice impacts on daily life functioning following STEM. So the current study that we are doing is a randomized clinical trial with 80 participants with moderate to severe TBI funded by NIDLR as part of our TBI model system. Individuals are at least 1 year post-injury with documented learning and memory deficits. They can be participants in our TBI model system or participants recruited from the community, it doesn't matter. Again, it's an RCT, so they're randomized to a treatment group or a control group. And then we're looking at outcome assessments. So we're looking at objective cognitive functioning via neuropsychological assessment. We're also focusing in a lot on those everyday life variables, mainly questionnaires, as well as an objective test of everyday life functioning. Our current enrollment is 29. 18 have completed their long-term follow-up. So this includes a 6-month follow-up, and 18 have completed that. And then there are 5 between the short and long-term follow-up. That's unfortunately where we had to pause our enrollment due to the pandemic. So we haven't really been in the office since the middle of March. So 1 person at the time is in the middle of their intervention, 1 person qualified and is awaiting baseline, and then 4 individuals are waiting to be screened once the pandemic restrictions are lifted and we can all get back to seeing our participants again. So that's a summary of our site-specific study. The last component that Yelena and I wanted to discuss during our presentation today was modular participation. So one of the real strengths of the TBI model system program are modules. Every center must participate in at least 1 module, and there are currently 10 ongoing modules. At the first project directors meeting, which is meetings we have twice a year of all the project directors nationwide, we select the modules that we're going to participate in based on the interests of our investigators and our resources. So every module has to have at least 4 participating centers, which is fantastic because you get much larger numbers. You're collecting across different geographic regions. So you have data that's much more generalizable to the entire country. And you have people with different skills working together to facilitate the optimal outcome for your study. So it's really a very strong design to be able to really collect data that's highly impactful. We have monthly conference calls and quarterly data submissions to keep everybody on track to be able to monitor participation. And these are the 10 topics in the current cycle. Problem solving training, both JFK and Kessler, we participate on that one together. And then there are several: caregiver resilience, health literacy, menopause, and trajectories of cognitive functioning, where Kessler is participating on those. And then JFK is participating in return to driving after moderate to severe TBI. So across the state, we're pretty well represented on the various modules that are ongoing in the current grant cycle. So I just want to touch really quickly on what these different modules look at, just a general summary, and then we'll move on. So if anyone has any questions, we have a few minutes to ask questions. So caregiver resilience is led by Virginia Commonwealth University, and it looks at the trajectory of caregiver resilience over the first 2 years post-injury, trying to identify those factors that increase resilience in this population. Problem-solving training is another caregiver-focused project, and this is the one that both JFK and Kessler are participating on. The lead center is North Texas TBI model system. And this is an inpatient study, which is kind of unique because most of our modular projects are outpatient studies. The objective is to test the feasibility and preliminary efficacy of a problem-solving training that is delivered to care partners during inpatient rehabilitation to help them prepare for that transition home. Health literacy following TBI looks at the contribution of health literacy to health outcomes. And that's led by Tier Memorial Hermann in Houston. Menopause in women with TBI examines symptoms of menopause in women with TBI and the extent to which that differs from individuals who do not have TBI. Trajectories of cognitive functioning after TBI is led by Mount Sinai, and this is a project that has been, it's been activated for several modules now in an effort to identify a cognitive battery that can be administered via telephone to be able to follow up all of our patients. What this particular module does is it looks at the changes in cognitive functioning over time in individuals who are 3 to 7 years post TBI and what factors lead to their patterns of change in cognitive function. And then return to driving after moderate to severe TBI is the module that JFK is participating in, but Kessler's not. And this is a study that looks to characterize short and long-term driving trends after moderate to severe TBI. That module has actually made quite a bit of progress over the first couple of years of our current cycle. So they're beginning to start their dissemination efforts, which is really fabulous. So that concludes my presentation, and I think we have, if I'm correct, we have about 5 minutes to address some questions.
Yes, we have about 4 minutes. I'm going to start off. This first question was for Dr. Golden. How can this data assist OTs in their clinical decision-making? In a long-term care setting, would it be advised to track AMPAC scores? And it's a two-part question, so I'll just ask the other one.
So I think the AMPAC scores can probably provide more information than some of the other traditional measures. And I see you asked about the modified Barthel index next. It can provide greater detail that can really help target treatments with greater accuracy. Whether it's advised to track AMPAC, I think that's more of a facility issue. It is a for-cost tool, so our center has a subscription. We do pay for it. It is much more time efficient. I think it loads more on activity limitations, which is the greater interest of rehabilitation, and should be more relevant to clinicians than some of the more traditional measures which focus more on impairments. But I think if there is an opportunity, it's definitely a great tool to use.
And then there's also a question for Dr. Chiaravalati. The question is, I am an OTR and I run cognitive groups related to everyday occupational functioning. Is there a STEM program that can be provided or purchased so my clients can improve their memory in my practice?
I so wish the answer to that was yes, but it is not available yet because we're still in the middle of our initial clinical trials. As soon as the clinical trials are over and we, are looking at that data and know that it works, we will be making it available, which will probably be another 2 years. So I'm sorry that I can't say yes to that question because our goal is really to get things out as fast as we can, but we wouldn't get it out until we know that it works with a larger clinical trial. So it's unfortunately not available. I presented this morning on the story memory technique. That is available because that's post clinical trial now, and we're applying it to different populations and doing other research on it, but that is available, but unfortunately STEM is not.
Okay. And then also for you, Doctor, this question says, has this study been done with people that have developmental disabilities such as Asperger's? And if so, what were the results?
STEM has not been done. No, we actually just developed STEM recently. So the first 2 studies, the first study was the one that I had just presented on, the MS pilot. And then we had a small TBI pilot. And now the next studies are these 2 large clinical trials that are ongoing now. So no, it has not been done with people with developmental disabilities. If there was a research group out there that wanted to do that, we would certainly be willing to collaborate with them because that would be a great population to apply it to.
Okay, and then this last question says, what are the caregivers' resilience factors that have shown to be most helpful?
We are not the lead center on that study, so we actually don't have the data and we have not looked at it yet. So I can't answer that question. I don't think they've actually looked at the data yet because they're still collecting it. I don't know when they'll be looking at that data.
Okay. All All right, well, thank you all so much. This actually concludes our workshop. Please complete your evaluations, refer to your email with the workshop links to select your next workshop, and we will begin our next workshop in the next 10 minutes. Thank you all so much.